Welcome back, pessoal. I am once again talking about the differences between European Portuguese and Brazilian Portuguese in this episode. Last week I had so much fun with my friends Leo and Carol explaining the differences between the pronunciation. Now, if you haven't seen that video yet, the link will be in the description, so make sure you check it out after you've watched this video. So today I'm going to be talking about the grammatical differences between the two. Now, lots of people think that it's much more straightforward than that. They're simply two different accents like you would have in America and England, for example, but actually it is quite a bit more complicated than that. We do have some grammatical differences that I'm going to be going over with you today. So if you are excited for this episode, make sure that you give me a like. And if you haven't subscribed yet, why not? It's free and it really helps my channel get seen. I give you a free episode every single week, so if you don't want to miss one, make sure you click the subscribe button and the bell as well. Let's dive in. So the first thing we're going to cover is the use of tu and você. Now, these are called personal pronouns and they are both equivalent to the word you in English when we're on friendly terms with somebody, except in Portugal we use tu and in Brazil we use você. The reason why this gets confusing is because you have to conjugate the verb you're using differently depending on which of these two you are going to use. So let's take the verb querer, for example, two ones. It would be tu queres, but it would be você quer. Now, usually in Portugal, we don't actually have to say the tu part, the personal pronoun. And if you're wondering a little bit more about that, I have another video here where I explain more about that in detail. But in Brazil, you will hear the personal pronoun você used all the time. This can get confusing because in Portugal, this is usually reserved for when you're being polite. But confusingly, it can also not be considered very polite if you actually use it in Portugal. I have another video here on how to be polite that explains that in a little bit more detail. So you can see how it gets a little bit confusing, right? But let's look at two sentences side by side so we can see how this would look different in an actual sentence. If I wanted to say, for example, do you want to go to the party? Leo from Lisbon would say this.
Queres ir para a festa?
Whereas Carol from Minas Gerais in Brazil would say this.
Você quer ir à festa?
So you can already see that we have a really big difference there in the grammatical structures that we are going to be using. Now, just to note that, of course, I'm talking in general terms here. There will be people in Brazil who use tu, and there will be people in Portugal who use você. These aren't set in stone. Language is fluid and changes depending on where you are. So these things that I'm going through with you today in this video is just me speaking in general terms. The next point is kind of similar. In Portugal, when we use the word we would use the personal pronoun nós. But in Brazil, they usually replace this with something different completely. They replace it with a gente. So again, we need a different verb conjugation depending on which of these we're going to choose. For nós, if we take the word ir, the verb to go, for example, for nós it would be nós vamos. But if we're choosing a gente, that actually gets conjugated in exactly the same way as você, which is also known as the third person singular. So, instead of nós vamos, it would be a gente vai. So you can already see here how it's actually quite a lot easier to speak Brazilian Portuguese if you are a beginner, because you have lots fewer conjugations to actually learn. In Brazil, the conjugations you're going to be using most of the time is I, the first person singular, then you'll jump to the third person singular to say você, you, and a gente, we. Then you only have the plural one to worry about, which would be you plural or they. So that's just three, whereas in Portugal we have two extra. We have the tu and the nós to worry about as well. So that's why this is actually the hardest thing for me when I was moving back from Brazil to Portugal, to remember all of these extra endings that I just simply wasn't using in Brazil. So if you wanted to take the sentence, for example, we are going to Italy tomorrow. Leo from Portugal would say,
Vamos para a Itália amanhã.
Whereas Carol from Brazil would say,
A gente vai para a Itália amanhã.
The next thing that is very different in European Portuguese and Brazilian Portuguese is the position of pronouns. And guess which one is about 500 times easier? It's the Brazilian one. The default rule in Brazilian Portuguese is to put pronouns ahead of the verb. That's it. That's the rule. In European Portuguese, however, the default is to put pronouns at the end of the verb, except in certain situations. Some of these situations will be when there is a negative word in the sentence, when there is a question word in the sentence, when there is a preposition. These I call magnet words, and they attract the pronoun before the verb. But you don't need to worry too much about that. I'm simply telling you that this is fluid in European Portuguese. There are reasons why we would put the pronoun before, and in Brazilian Portuguese it's just simply the rule. They always go before. So what do I even mean by a pronoun here? Well, if I took the sentence I love you and want to see you, okay, the you in that point is going to be a pronoun. And as I said, in Brazil, it will always come first. But in European Portuguese, because there are none of those words that I just explained, negative, question, for example, because there aren't any of those in the sentence, it's going to come at the end. So if we take that sentence, I love you and I want to see you, Leo from Lisbon would say this.
Amo-te e quero ver-te.
Whereas Carol from Brazil would say,
Eu te amo e quero te ver.
So you can really see how there are quite significant differences between the two. Next up, we have the present continuous tense. This is when we are talking about something that we are doing right now. So for example, I am talking, I am teaching. Now, in Brazil, we do this very similar to the way we would do it in Spanish. We use something called the gerund. So we need the verb estar, and then we need the verb in the gerund form. So what would that look like? If I wanted to say I am working, in Brazil we would say estou trabalhando. So this ando is what we're referring to as the gerund. Estou trabalhando. But in Portugal we don't do it like that. We still need the verb estar, but instead of the gerund we are going to add an a and then the whole verb in the infinitive form. So instead of estou trabalhando, we would say estou a trabalhar. Now, of course, people in real life don't talk like that. They will probably knock off that es and you will just hear tô. Tô trabalhando. Tô a trabalhar. All right, let's hear Leo and Carol say these like native speakers.
Estou a trabalhar.
Tô trabalhando.
The final difference I am going to go through in this lesson today is again about pronouns. Now, if I wanted to say, for example, I saw him. I saw him. Again, that him is something that we would call a pronoun, in this case, a direct object pronoun. Now, in Portugal, we would replace this with the word o. Eu vi o. I saw him. However, in Brazil, it's actually very common, particularly when we are speaking, not so much when we are writing things down because it technically isn't grammatically correct. You will often hear people, instead of using this u or an a if it was a woman, you would hear people using the personal pronoun here instead. So if you wanted to say I saw him, it's very common in Brazil to hear eu vi ele, okay? So they would put the ele there, which in European Portuguese we would pronounce el, instead of what we refer to as the direct object pronoun, u. So let's hear the guys say those two side by side.
Eu vi-o.
Eu vi ele.
So as you can see, there is a lot to think about, a lot of differences between European Portuguese and Brazilian Portuguese. It is not just as simple as having a different accent. If you found this interesting today, I hope that you will leave me a like and you will consider subscribing to the channel if you enjoy my videos. And next week, you are not going to miss what we've got coming for you next. I'm going to be on Leo's channel, Portuguese with Leo, discussing the same topics but in Portuguese. So you are not going to want to miss that. make sure that you are subscribed to his channel too. I will leave the link in the description. I'll be back with my own video next week with more tips and tutorials to improve your Portuguese, so I hope I will see you there. Ciao for now!